Let's be honest, few humans enjoy meetings, and many feel trapped in meetings. As leaders, we don't want to burden those we lead, but meetings can seem to do that more often than not. We wanted to address the pain of meetings through the Meetings with Saints library. Here we have 15 plus presentations dedicated to improving the meetings we run. We have experts in the field addressing topics like getting people involved in meetings, staying on task, dealing with conflict in meetings, and a ton more. We'd love you to explore the full Meetings with Saints library over 14 days at no cost to you. You can do this by visiting leadingsaints.org/14. That's leadingsaints.org/14. We'll also give you access to all of our virtual libraries that educate about other leadership topics. It's really good stuff, so visit leadingsaints.org/14 or click the link in the show notes. The following episode is a throwback episode, one that was published previously and was extremely popular. To see the details of when this was originally published, see the show notes. Enjoy this throwback episode. As a young ironic priesthood holder, I was of course assigned a home teaching companion, and went out and home taught with Ken Christopher, who was a fantastic mentor in my early life that really showed me how to home teach. And I remember sitting in these home teaching appointments just petrified to say anything. I didn't want to talk. I was embarrassed. I was quiet. I just couldn't wait for it to be over so I'd go home and return to my life. And now, obviously, I matured, and part of that was just being a young teenager, didn't know how to articulate myself and those types of things. But as I got older, I got easier at communicating with people. But in general, over the years, I've noticed that I definitely lean towards the introvert side of things. When I'm in groups of people, I can be outgoing, I can work the room, I can speak from the lectern and with confidence, but I definitely feel a recharge when I return home and a refuel in my own home and in my familiar surroundings. And this concept of introverts in the LDS faith is interesting to me. It's something I've been thinking about for years and years. And so I was really excited when I came across the book, Introverts at Church: Finding Our Place in an Extroverted Culture. Now, this book is written by Adam S. McHugh, who is an ordained Presbyterian minister, spiritual director, chaplain, speaker, and retreat leader. He has been published in the Washington Post, the Christian Century, Relevant Magazine, Psychology Today, and Leadership Journal, among other publications. He graduated from Claremont McKenna College and Princeton Theological Seminary. And when I got this book, I dove in. I was definitely intrigued to hear about what Adam had to say about introverts in church, even though he doesn't have an LDS background or Mormon faith. His experience in his own Presbyterian faith really relates to the experience that many of us as leaders have with introverts in our wards and stakes, and how to connect with them, how to give them a faith experience that is beneficial to their personality, to their experience as an introvert. And this led to a great discussion that Adam and I had. I'm excited to share it with you. So here is my interview with Adam S. McHugh, the author of Introverts in the Church. Today we are communicating with Adam McHugh in California. How are you, Adam?
Doing very well. How about yourself?
Very good. Did I say your last name correctly?
You got it.
Good. All right. Very nice. Very nice. Now, you are, tell us a little bit about what we need to know about you. The big thing, I guess, on this podcast, we generally have LDS or Mormons on as guests, but you are not a Mormon. So what are you?
It is true. I am an ordained Presbyterian minister, though in truth, I go to an Episcopal church.
Nice.
But I was ordained in the Presbyterian church about 12 years ago.
Nice. And so what is when you say you're ordained, what does that mean? Does that mean you went to seminary for a while, or what does that mean?
It means they made me jump through about 1,000 hoops is basically what that means. I went to Princeton Theological Seminary, and that is required for ordination, not Princeton, but going to seminary, getting a master's of divinity. I also stuck around for another year and got a master's of theology and Greek New Testament as well, and had to do 2 church internships and 1 internship at a hospital as a chaplain, which was actually very instrumental in my future calling. And and then I had to go to about 1,000 meetings in order to get approved.
Wow, intense.
It was, I would never do it again.
Oh, yeah.
I'm glad I was young when I went through all of that, because now it sounds exhausting.
So does that mean, your day-to-day, are you some type of pastor to a church, or what's your day-to-day job now?
I have the title now, writer and speaker and retreat leader is really how I identify myself. I'm certainly connected to churches and all of that. Also a certified spiritual director as well, but I don't have a formal preaching ministry, or I'm not working full time at a church.
And is that the typical path for someone who's gone through the different education you've gone to, that they end up with running some type of a church, or?
Usually, or else, working as a chaplain of some kind, which I did for a few years. But generally, the Presbyterian minister is going to be a minister at a particular church. And it's not like other denominations where you move around from church to church. Mm-hmm. You sort of stay in one place and you're hired more like a regular person, and you move on more like a sort of a regular job. It's some churches, you stay 3 years and then they move you somewhere else. It's not like that.
Nice. So what is your experience with Mormons? I hope nothing negative.
Nothing negative. I have an aunt and cousins that I grew up in Seattle, and we were all in Seattle. And then when I was about 14, my aunt and uncle and my cousins, who were really my best friends at the time, moved to Boise, Idaho, and got connected pretty quickly with the Mormon Church. And so that's really the extent of my experience with the Mormon Church. And when they moved to a new place, and that community was really the first to reach out to them, and I know that they felt very embraced by that.
Oh, nice. So they're pretty devout at this point in the church.
They are. They've had their ups and downs, as we all do in our faith.
Yeah, for sure.
But absolutely, they're very well connected.
Nice. Now, the reason I initially reached out to you for this interview is you are the author of a book called Introverts in the Church: Finding Our Place in an Extroverted Culture. Now, what led you to writing this book? I think it's a fantastic, inspired book that needed to be written. So what led you to the point of writing it?
Honestly, it started out as very personal. It was almost kind of a self-apologetic to begin with. So it was especially I worked in a church shortly after seminary. And then after that, I really loved college students. And so I worked as a college campus minister at the Claremont colleges in Southern California for 3 or 4 years. That was where I knew that I was on the introverted side of things. I always knew that I needed solitude to recharge, and that I was a little bit quieter than some people, especially in new situations. But it was leading these incredibly energetic college students with all of the social demands of being on a college campus that made me really realize how much that shaped how I live and act and communicate. And it was a bit of a struggle, to be honest with you, just the social demands of campus ministry that don't have quite the same boundaries that working in churches does. And so that was a big part of it when I realized, God, I'm just so exhausted all the time. What is happening here? I couldn't figure it out. But then at the same time, I was leading a group of student leaders, and it turned out that a lot of them were introverts as well, which was surprising to me. I hadn't been the one that had chosen them for that team. I inherited that. They turned out to be actually mostly introverted. And so they were having a lot of the same issues and a lot of the same questions that I was. And so it kind of became this kind of experimental breeding ground for how to lead and communicate and minister and share your faith as an introvert. And that's really where the book Introverts in the Church was born.
Yeah. So was this something that you sort of wrote on the side with no intention of it being a book, or did it naturally develop that way?
Oh, it was a dream and an ambition of mine for a long time to get published. So I had every intention on getting it published, and I had a connection with an editor at InterVarsity Press in Chicago. And so it was always my intention. When I first sent in a book proposal, it was exclusively about introverts and leadership, ministry specifically. They said no to that, which was crushing. But then I came back as more of a broader look at introversion in church culture. So not just, I have a lot on leadership, but also sharing your faith and introverts in community, introverted spirituality, and just kind of introverts in church in general. And so it became a much broader book, which I'm grateful for, because I think it's a better book as a result of that.
Nice, nice. And I read the book and really, really enjoyed it and had several highlights that we'll hit on a few of those as we go through this. But I guess I've thought about this concept of introverts a lot just in the LDS culture with different traditions we have. Sometimes they don't play well to introverts. And then there's others that I think really do play well to introverts. But for you personally, I guess I consider myself an introvert, not that I've taken a personality test or anything, and I'm not assuming you have either, but what can you tell us about what an introvert is and how you started to begin to classify yourself as an introvert?
Yeah, there are a bunch of different ways to look at this. The most general way to say it is introversion is an inward orientation, whereas extroversion is an outward orientation. And it's really important to realize that introversion and extroversion is not an either or within us. It's not a dichotomy. You're not either an introvert or an extrovert, though that's the language we often use just for simplicity's sake. But we all have the inward direction in our lives, and we all have the outward direction, orientation in our lives. And it's a continuum. It's a line. And your tendency is to fall on one side or the other. You feel most at home in a particular place. And so for me, sort of my inner world, my inner thoughts, impulses, feelings, impressions, that's where I feel most at home, where I feel most comfortable. Whereas moving in that outward direction feels a little bit like leaving home for me. I'm capable of it. And, when you're in ministry long enough, you have to learn how to do it well. But that still feels like walking in foreign land for me, whereas I'm most at home in my inner world. And then there's a few more specific characteristics of introversion. And the one that usually gets the most attention and the question that drives it is, how do you refuel? Given that we all have a finite amount of energy, where do you find your energy? How do you recharge? And for introverts, it has to do with being in solitude. I can be out in the world interacting with people, talking to other people, having different experiences, but that drains my energy. And so I have to come back into myself, into privacy, into solitude, or into conversation with a really close friend or family member in order to refuel. And that's a big part of it. Introverts are fueled by solitude, whereas extroverts, they can enjoy being by themselves. They can enjoy privacy, but too much of that is going to leave them feeling haggard and tired. And so they actually get more energy as they're out among people in the external world. And, you go to a party and you can sort of identify the introverts, maybe not right away, but you can identify them about an hour later because they're starting to look tired. They're starting to retreat to the fringes, whereas the extroverts are getting louder and more excitable and more energetic. And so that's the big part, the big distinction. The other one would be how we process information. Introverts tend to go quiet when they're given new information, and they process silently and they think before they speak, whereas extroverts tend to process out loud. They talk through things, and you hear and see their process a lot more than you do with introverts. And so it's often been said that introverts think in order to speak, whereas extroverts speak in order.
Love that. And it's the stereotype is that introverts are the shy ones, right? But as you said here, you quote Susan Cain, who's the author of Quiet, another fantastic book on introverts. But you quote her as the introverts are not antisocial, but they're differently social.
Yeah, I really like that part of her book. And there's a lot of stereotypes that go along with introverts, that we're shy or we're reclusive or we're misanthropic, that we don't like people, and that we're turtles that just need to come out of our shells, or that we have social anxiety. And of course, introverts can have all of that, but that's not the proper definition of an introvert. I'm an introvert. I am not shy. I don't have social anxiety. I'm not reclusive. But, obviously, when you're an introvert and you're misunderstood, that can lead to other issues as well. But that's not the proper definition of introversion. So Susan Cain says we're differently social, which means we may prefer a fewer number of friends. We may prefer less active, less stimulation in our environments. But we're not antisocial. We like people, we love people, and we love people very deeply, especially when we get to know them really well.
Yeah. And I would relate to that as well. I think if individuals saw me in a public setting, especially when I served as a bishop, it was like, I didn't mind working the room. I didn't mind speaking. I didn't mind those things. But by the end of the day, I was exhausted and going home. I just loved being at home in my own bubble, doing my own thing and refueling that way. Right.
Absolutely. And then for me, when I was working at a church and I was preaching every Sunday, you have that 3 or 4 hours on Sunday morning where you're on, and there's something about being in that role that sort of gives you permission to do it. And people know, like, okay, he's going to now, introduce himself to people because he's the pastor. And there's something about that that's kind of empowering. But then I would go home and take like a 2-hour nap afterwards. I would just be exhausted afterwards.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. So from your faith experience, what's the problem that introverts, what's the friction that introverts experience at church?
I think the main problem, and it's a much bigger problem than people realize, and everyone immediately, I'm not sure what happens in the LDS church, but in a lot of Protestant churches, there's the sort of informal greeting time somewhere in the middle of the worship service. Do you have that in Mormon churches where you turn to your neighbor and greet each other?
Nothing like formal that's maybe, the bishop or someone would say to do, but there's definitely like the 5 or 10 minutes before sacrament meeting starts where people are either, in their pew by themselves and maybe members of the bishopric are going around shaking hands. So, but it's not necessarily a formal, activity.
Got it. Well, in a lot of Protestant churches, there's this turn to your neighbor part right in the middle of the worship. So it might come like after announcements or something like that. And that's whenever I talk about this topic, that's what always gets the attention. People, introverts are like, that's my least favorite part. Like, I'll go to the bathroom in the middle of that. Like, it's so dreadful. And that's sort of becomes this lightning rod that gets the attention of the issue. But I think if we move away from that, it's a much larger issue. And the main problem is, in my experience and in the experience of a lot of introverts, we conceive of the faith as in a very extroverted way. And if you think about, what are some of the ideal attributes of a believer in communities that I've been a part of, it's someone who's gregarious, someone who is very eager to meet new people, to join new activities, to host people in their homes, maybe someone who leaps into leadership very quickly and very easily and is just active and moving and all of that. And that becomes this ideal that we hold up as here's the ideal Christian. And what about those of us, though, who don't actually fit that? And so we end up, it's not just a feeling kind of excluded. It's a feeling that somehow I am inadequate spiritually, that my faith isn't as strong. And that if my faith were stronger, then I would be more like that person. And that to me is the main issue that we face as introverts in churches. And so that's why I've spent the last few years talking about this, trying to say there are different ways to interact. There are different ways to express our faith and to participate in church communities that are equally faithful but different.
Yeah. And in the book, I think you talk about this concept in the context of personal vulnerability. And you said that some churches also gauge commitment by the amount of personal vulnerability a person shows. Evangelicals really like to share. And that really jumped out to me because in the LDS faith, so every first Sunday is during our traditional sacrament meeting, we have what's called fast and testimony meeting. So we have, the announcements, we'll do some, word business if we need to. And then we have the sacrament. And then after the sacrament, it's just open mic. We talk in jest about it as open mic Sunday, where the bishop may share his testimony and proclaim his beliefs. And then he sits down and anybody's welcome to come up and share it. And it sort of created this cultural dynamic in the LDS faith that's sort of, you're a good Mormon if you go up there and say, I know, and I believe, and to stand in front of the congregation and proclaim your belief. Right. And so and this relates well with, that evangelicals just really like to share, and Mormons are the same way. We have this setting where we want people to stand up and share, and we hate the silence in between testimonies. Like, right. Oh no, like why aren't people getting up? Right.
Right. And that's the idea that somehow I'm more faithful, that my faith is stronger if I am eager to vulnerably share and proclaim that in front of a bunch of strangers, or people. But
Yeah.
And of course, we don't reject that, but at the same time, I just don't think that people who are extroverted realize just how uncomfortable and awkward and painful that sort of experience can be for people who prefer to sort of sit on the sidelines, who might listen a lot more than they speak, whose experience of faith may be very deep, but also very quiet and very personal. And so I just don't think that a lot of this issue becomes a matter of understanding and trying to explain, here's what my tendencies are. And when you say go up and share vulnerably in front of a bunch of people, that is extremely uncomfortable for me. And I would much prefer to talk one-on-one with someone and to realize that is an equally viable expression of faith.
Yeah. And it's not that introverts don't express their faith. It's just there's multiple layers to those introverts, and it may take additional time or different settings, or like you said, the one-on-one setting to really be able to share that faith.
And there's also just the issue of preparation when it comes to public speaking as well. I'm a pretty good public speaker, but I'm a terrible public speaker if I haven't had time to really prepare what it is that I'm going to say and have notes in front of me. The introverts tend not to be as good on their feet as extroverts are, because sort of the way that our brains work is actually different. And so we can't come up with words as quickly as extroverts can. And so if I have had time to prepare, if I'm teaching a class or if I'm preaching a sermon and I've had plenty of time to prepare, I'm very good. If someone asks me to speak on my feet, I'm not nearly as good, and I get much more uncomfortable.
Nice. Yeah. So anything else as far as general introverts go, as far as setting this up, is that a good foundation to dive into some of these concepts?
We covered most of it. The other thing the other attribute that's fairly common in the whole conversation is introverts tend to prefer depth over breadth. And so we prefer fewer but deeper relationships, and we may not consider acquaintances to be our friends. And we may say we only have a couple of friends, even if we do interact with a lot of other people. And so it has to do with relationships, but it also has to do with interests in some cases. I think more, of course, speaking in generalizations here, but introverts tend to prefer greater depth and fewer interests as well. They may not be as interested in as many things, but the things they are interested in, they may spend a lot of time with.
And so is there any general advice you'd give to a pastor or somebody who's, running a church to gain that depth rather than the breadth?
That's a good question. I think, classes that are going to go into detail into different topics are going to be of greater interest. There are different ways of reading the scriptures in more sort of contemplative ways that may appeal to some introverts as well. But the larger issue in terms of church involvement is to realize that there may be a more introverted person. It may be a great step of courage for them to be a part of one event, one activity, one group. It's going to be less likely that they're going to be involved in a dozen different things at one time. And I think that sometimes that's viewed as sort of the epitome of faithfulness. If you're doing 10 different things in a given week, and that involvement is probably more temperamental than it is spiritual.
Yeah. In the book, you talk about the power of listening. And I think this is a really key concept for leaders to understand that, have obviously every leader probably has a handful or many more introverts in their congregation. And you tell the story about when you were a chaplain at a hospital and was called to a bedside with a family as their loved one passed on. Would you mind telling that story?
Yeah, absolutely. It was one of my first real interactions as part of being ordained in the Presbyterian Church, I had to do what's called CPE, Clinical Pastoral Education. And what that meant, among other things, is that for 4 months, I was a chaplain intern at St. Joseph's Hospital in Orange, California. And so usually I was on the oncology floor during the week, but I was also on call a few Saturdays during that internship. And I got called one time to the bedside of someone who was dying. Basically, when they called code blue, that meant that the chaplain had to go as well because someone was dying. And so I got there and I walked in, and there were about 20 family members surrounding this bed. It was a Hispanic family. And I was so nervous. This was one of my very first real sort of chaplain interactions. I had no idea what to say, what to do. I was probably shaking a little bit. I was so nervous. Death was really new to me as well. And so I got in there with about 20 people, and I sort of stumbled around, and I sort of introduced myself and tried to ask a couple of questions like, just about the family or about the person that was dying. And everyone just sort of looked at me and then turned back to the patients. And it was so uncomfortable and awkward. And so eventually I stopped talking, and I just went silent, and I just stood there. It felt like an hour and a half. It was probably 20 minutes. We just sat there and we watched the patient's heart on the monitor, beat and watched the chest go up and down for what felt like forever to me. And I just felt ridiculous. I felt like, why am I here? What am I doing? But I just stood there silently, some sort of chaplain prayer pose for however long that was. Then the patient flatlined, breathing stopped, they died. I sat there with them for a few more minutes, offered my condolences, and then left. And for me, it was this huge act of failure. I had completely failed as a pastor. I didn't know what to say, didn't know what to do, didn't bring them any comfort or encouragement or hope. And so I just felt like, what am I doing with my life? Why in the world would I think that I could be a pastor? And so, but the next week, I checked my mailbox at the hospital, and I got this card from the family, and it said, "Thank you so much for being there in our time of grief. Now you are part of our family." And I was like, I was stunned, because I thought it had been this great act of failure. But that was the moment I realized that presence, that silence, that listening, that simply being there is so much more significant and powerful than any words that can be uttered in a situation like that. And so that's what opened me up to this world of a ministry of presence, a ministry of listening that has really shaped me to this day. I mean, I wrote a whole second book about the topic of listening called The Listening Life that came out a couple of years ago. It was so significant.
Nice. There's this, that experience reminds me of this hilarious movie I saw years ago called Lars and the Real Girl. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but it's sort of this weird, dark comedy. But there's this moment where, Lars, the main character, has sort of lost this loved one. And these women come over, and they're just sitting there and in his home. And they say, I forget the verbatim, the line, but they basically said, when people are going through a hard time, this is what people do. They come to their house and just sit. And there's such a lesson there, because I know as a leader, you sort of, you're called to these different scenarios where maybe someone has cancer or that's lost a loved one, and you show up and you feel like, I'm supposed to restore hope through my words and maybe share a scripture that just changes the mood or whatever. But there's some unique power in just showing up and sitting and being there and being present with them and taking on that burden with them. Right.
Absolutely. And I feel that exact same pressure as a minister. You feel like you have to come in and somehow rescue people or find just the right words that are going to create hope or a feeling of joy, or that's somehow going to take away the pain and the grief, which, by the way, is utterly impossible.
Right.
And we should all stop trying to do that, not just ministers, but everyone. And a lot of that, let's be honest, a lot of that comes out of our own anxiety. We feel like we get so anxious in situations of pain and grief because it's so uncomfortable for us personally as well, because it taps into our own experiences of pain and grief. And so we want to make everybody feel better so that we can feel better, we sort of get this rescue complex in those situations. And it's actually not a healthy activity. And it makes things worse in a lot of cases. When someone gets a sermon preached to them when they're in pain, it has a way of distancing people, and it also has a way of making people feel as though somehow if I had more faith that I wouldn't be going through this ordeal.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think this is that scenario shared. I think it is an interesting segue to this concept of small talk, because I know many times as a leader, I would show up and going back to your experience, it would be easy to walk in there and ask the family, so where are you from? Like, oh, wow. And tell us about your dad or whomever's dying. And right. And so we sort of default to this small talk, and that happens anywhere. Like you may be greeting somebody at church and you don't know what to say. So you go with the small talk. how's your job going? But tell us about how small talk is just painful for introverts.
It's a hard topic because there's sometimes when you have to make small talk if you're meeting someone, because to sort of try to launch into some deep topic is really awkward and lacks boundaries, like you can't do that to somebody. And so it's sort of a necessary evil in a lot of cases, but there is a way. And like I said earlier, I know, especially if there's like time before a worship service starts and people are sort of socializing, I know a lot of introverts that actually show up late to church to avoid that. That will actually show up 5 minutes late to church because they find that so dreadful. And it gets back to the like kind of thinking on your feet thing and the sort of moving gracefully through a conversation, which a lot of us more introverted types don't really excel at. And there's something to be said about, the fact that we prefer depth is going to obviously make us try to steer away from small talk. And it's a tricky situation for me, though, because I also realize you're going to be uncomfortably intense if you try to press too deeply with someone that you don't know very well. If it's someone you do know well and you can sort of move past the conversations about the weather, then that's more comfortable. But Susan Cain kind of compares it to a dance where you're like stepping lively through the topics of the day. And a lot of us just are not very skilled at that, who much prefer to sort of listen than we prefer to engage. And then if we finally do come up with something to say, people have already moved on to other topics by the time we actually come up with a response to what they've been talking about before.
Yeah. Yeah. And so there should be a rule of like, don't even try small talk. It's sort of a necessary evil, right? And it is what it is. But just being aware of that, every time you interact with somebody and, maybe they do have some introvert tendencies and your conversation's always superficial, like maybe there's an opportunity to build a deeper relationship there, right?
Absolutely. Speaking of small talk, I know introverts who actually, when they're going to like a work event, like some sort of networking event or some social work event, they actually will sort of prepare. they'll go and they'll read the news carefully and they'll come up with like something to say that's relevant to the topic of the day, or they'll actually, if they know who they're going to be talking to, they'll actually do a little bit of homework into that to try and make it a little bit less awkward. But, at some point, you're going to have to talk about the weather at some point if you want to talk about anything of greater depth.
Yeah.
It's just the reality of it.
And as far as conversations go, another aspect of communication that you talked about is you said when introverts conflict with each other, though it may require a map to follow all the silences, nonverbal cues, and passive-aggressive behaviors. And so this is another thing. As a leader, sometimes, and I get questions all the time that from people in different auxiliaries in our church that are facing difficult leadership scenarios where one individual in their group or who they lead is just not up to par, or they're doing something that's not up to expectations. And they just say, what should I do? And they're looking for a tactic or something that they can do. And in reality, I tell them, well, it sounds like you just need to go have a conversation. But it sounds like, and I'm the type of person, I really tried to develop a skill of, having critical or crucial conversations and having these tough, difficult conversations from time to time as a leader. But introverts, there may be a lot of passive aggressiveness, right? And like you said, the silences, or they may resolve these conflicts in a different way. Is that accurate?
Yeah, we all have different tendencies in conflict, and generally speaking, a lot of introverts tend to go quiet in situations of conflict. They're afraid of saying the wrong thing, or they just have to process internally what's happening. They just I know I have experiences of just freezing up sometimes in situations of conflict, just not being able to say anything. Whereas, extroverts may be sort of more aggressive in situations of conflict, may be more outspoken in situations of conflict. And so it is important to realize we have different ways of doing it. And, that's, if you're talking about like a spouse situation, the whole timeout thing that we all do with our kids is still pretty useful, I think, for us as adults, especially for introverts, just kind of need time to gather their thoughts so that then they can come and express them after they've had time to process them. I think the direction of healthy conflict is being able to share your thoughts, to share your feelings in a constructive way. It just may take longer for introverts to be able to get to that. And if something comes up in a spontaneous moment, we may just freeze up. And so I think it's important in resolving conflict to allow introverts the time to really think through their thoughts and feelings, to be able to process it internally, and then to be able to share and to realize that if you put us on the spot, we're probably going to freeze up and things aren't going to go anywhere.
Yeah. And so how do introverts typically address, problems, or if they are the leader and there's a problem or a conflict, are they less likely to just approach it and talk about it, or how do they go about that?
Yeah, I would say, that it may take us longer to actually get to having that conversation because it is an uncomfortable matter for us. We tend to internalize our emotions, and we may hold on to things, longer than extroverts do, and sort of think through things, dwell through things. We even sort of, I know I have a lot of verbal jousts in my head as I'm sort of imagining the conflict that I'm going to have with somebody else, which isn't always a healthy activity. But, I think ultimately, we are, called to be at peace and to reconcile with one another and to address conflict, but just to realize it may take longer for introverts to get there. And if you put us into sort of a high tension atmosphere, we may run from it as fast as possible.
Yeah.
So I think just, again, that time to internally process things and maybe talking through with someone that we trust, like, hey, what do you think about this? What do you think I should do? Can be, a really helpful exercise.
That's great advice. And I'm thinking of, we have, in a typical ward, we have what's called a ward council. And so the bishop leads this council, and then it's made up of, the different leaders within the ward, the leader of the young men and the young women, and the Relief Society, which is the women's group, and they all meet in this council. And sometimes those extroverts in the room can sort of be overbearing to the introverts, right? And so when there's conflict between the extrovert and an introvert, how do we go about just not letting the introvert just run all over everybody?
The extrovert run over everybody, you mean?
Yeah.
Okay. Again, it comes down to self-awareness. It comes down to, helping people understand their own tendencies in situations of conflict, situations of leadership, tense situations. And, if the extrovert isn't aware of that, it would be helpful to make that person aware of that in a gentle way.
Yeah. And one thing I'm learning from what you're saying is that it sounds like, a lot of times in those council meetings, we sort of, as the leader, the bishop may want to push the discussion to a decision or resolving the conflict. But it sounds like for that introvert, sometimes you may need to table it until the next meeting and allow those introverts in the room to process it, then come back with a well-rounded thought.
Yeah, I mean, I'm even a fan of like a lengthy break in the middle of meetings in some cases to allow the more introverted types, number one, to get a little bit of time to breathe, but also to process and then come back in and talk it through. And, just in terms of thinking about meetings, when I've led meetings, I always try to, more formal meetings, I always try to give an agenda of what we're going to talk about in advance, a day or two in advance. And then I am a fan of a long break in the middle of a meeting. And then also, I think you're absolutely right. Like you can say, well, here's the issue at hand. Here's what we're dealing with. So next time we meet, once you think that through, next time we meet, let's talk that through.
Yeah. Anything else as far as around the concept of the power of listening that would be helpful to address, or have we covered it?
I think we've probably covered it. I just I cannot sort of overestimate the power of listening in our society and in our churches, especially in a world in which I think people are not really listening. People in power are not really listening. And you can it's hard to say too much about how powerful it is for someone to actually genuinely be heard, feel respected in what they're saying and feeling, rather than having someone try to compete with them or to run over them or to speak over them.
Yeah. And then the other concept you talk about is the power of silence. And I don't know if you've ever had an opportunity, obviously in the Mormon faith, we have our temples and our chapels, and our chapels are where we attend on, the week to week on Sundays, and temples have other, ordinances and purposes there. And when we build a temple, we have an open house that's open to the public. Have you ever had a chance to go to a temple open house?
I never have.
Well, as from one extrovert to the next, I hope you take the opportunity the next time you have that, because as I read your book, I was just one LDS tradition I was so grateful for is the dichotomy between our chapels and our temples, where a chapel is very much a place where extroverts can thrive. There's lots of speaking going on. That's where we have our social events, and week to week, there's lots of small talk going on, lots of lessons and participation. And where our temples it's a very internal experience. We'll go in and really, typically when we go to the temple on a traditional endowment experience, we say very few, if I can't think of more than 50 words that we would say during that time. And then we go into what's called the celestial room. And man, this is a introvert's paradise. And so if you have an opportunity to walk through a celestial room, it's remarkable, because it's a room where really people are meant to just sit and ponder and meditate and pray and seek for spiritual guidance and things. But anyway, so I appreciate this part about silence you talk about and the power it is. And I sort of thought, oh, good, I think maybe we figure something out with these, chapels and temples dichotomy there. But tell us about silence as far as how you've seen it work in churches, or how some churches just totally miss the opportunity of silence.
Yeah, it's an interesting conversation. So I now attend an Episcopal church, and one of the first things that really attracted me to that experience was, instead of churches in the past where I've walked in and it's this chatty mingling, it feels like a cocktail party when you walk in, everyone just chatting and laughing, and that's very intimidating for me. Whereas when I walk into an Episcopal or an Anglican church, it's this kind of spirit of quiet reverence. People are not talking, and if they are, they're talking in hushed tones, which is different for me from other church experiences that I've had. And it lets me feel like, it feels like you're kind of walking into a holy place. And that has a way of sort of settling you down and focusing your heart and making you think about different things. And I love that kind of atmosphere. I feel really at home with that. And so I've consulted with churches about this that really they really want that friendly, social, chatty, outgoing kind of atmosphere when you walk into a church service. And I just say, look, that's fine. That's your culture. Just be aware that that's going to be very intimidating for a lot of people. And so if there are ways that you can find these even moments of silence, or if you can offer different sorts of services, like it sounds like you're talking about with the temple experiences, that are more silent, that are quieter, that are more contemplative, that's going to be much more comfortable and spiritual for, the more introverted people in your community. And so, and so, some churches will try to experiment with a little bit of silence in the middle of a service. The problem with that is always that people think there's some sort of mistake that's been made, that people forgot something. So you have to be very clear about what's happening. Or some people will do a silence that lasts for about 8 seconds, and that obviously isn't really addressing anything. And so I'm a fan of offering different sorts of services or studies or even song type experiences that are different from your Sunday morning services, that silence may feel more like being at home for the introverts in your group.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the important point here is that you're not suggesting that church leaders need to completely overhaul the structure of their meetings and how they do things, but it's just in the little things, right? And you mentioned in the book that of a church that allows a full 2 minutes of silence after every sermon, simply inserting that regular pauses in the content of the worship service instead of rushing from one component to the next. And so just these little things, and it made me think of on these testimony meetings, the open mic Sundays, that in between testimonies, there is some silence there, or people maybe aren't as readily standing up and filling that dead air, but just embracing it and looking at it as a time for the congregation to ponder over what's been said and the spirit that's there. And even I think of Sunday school meetings where, just the last Sunday, I was in a class, and the instructor asked us to take 5 minutes and write some thoughts and ponder over that. And we sometimes that's not in our typical tradition, so we don't think of that right away, but it's just in those little things, right?
Absolutely. And I think that's a good start with the little things. The small steps are obviously a great start. And, there's other things that you can do, like dimming lights at a certain point that has that same effect. It's hard when the lights are dim to really talk loud for some reason. And so there are different symbolic.
Yeah. Yeah. And as we wrap up here, in the later part of the book, you talk about introvert leaders. And, sometimes we see the ideal leader, that someone who's outgoing and loves to be in front of people, always working in the room or whatever it is, and, refueled by that experience. But I guess you mentioned in the book that both introverts and extroverts sort of prefer extrovert leaders. Is that accurate?
That's been the consistent sort of results of studies that have been done about this, is that even introverts, say they prefer extroverted leaders. And I just think that continues to be sort of a cultural clash that we experience. And there's even studies that have been done that portray Jesus as an extrovert, which I think is a very interesting thing. When you look at the Gospels, there's a lot of solitude and privacy that he seeks out. But I do think it seems like our ideal leader still culturally is an extrovert, and, working the room. That's exactly it. Aggressive, assertive, like able to turn strangers into friends very quickly. And so many introverted potential leaders that I know sort of disqualify themselves from leadership preemptively because they see that and they're like, I could never do that. And so, a good third of the book, Introverts in the Church, is devoted to leadership, because that's a big passion of mine. And a lot of it is just kind of breaking down the sort of stereotypes of leadership and realizing, there are actually different ways to lead. And maybe someone who's really aggressive and gregarious is not actually the best leader for a community that tends to be more introverted. That can feel very invasive, And so I do think, though, that there are a lot of stereotypes that we hold on to that are probably keeping our communities from really realizing their full potential in a lot of ways, because not every church has, that sort of leader. And I think it's actually much healthier to have a diverse community of leaders than it is to have one person who is pushing everything forward.
Yeah. Yeah. And so as far as getting more introverts to lead, especially in the LDS faith, we have calling. So, as the bishop, I would select the Relief Society president, obviously through prayer and contemplation. And, that she would lead the women's organization in the word. And sometimes it's easy to just default to those extroverts, right? So is there any way to encourage those introverts to step up and lead and have more confidence in leading? Or
absolutely. And, I've attended churches that had leadership sort of discernment classes that talked about personality type. They talked about different gifts. And consistently we see that gifting is not related to temperament. Some of the best preachers I know are very introverted people. Some of the worst preachers I know are very extroverted people. And, that's generalizing.
Yeah, sure.
Just because you talk a lot doesn't mean you're speaking well, And so I think we have to continue to disassemble the stereotypes. And it's helpful for someone who's an introvert who could potentially be a leader to have someone take an interest in them, to have one person invest in them, sort of say, hey, I just want you to know, like, I see the gifts that you have, and maybe we can help develop those together. Maybe an extrovert and an introvert can partner together to start with. And yeah, I think that one-on-one investment or that small group investment can be a way to help introverts kind of feel empowered to step up and lead.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that advice. What about non-believing introverts, inviting them to participate in church and come to Christ? And I know, typically, at least in the LDS faith tradition, it's like, okay, we have sister so-and-so and her husband who doesn't come to church, and man, what can we do to reach out to him? It usually ends up of, let's go visit him, and, we're having a barbecue this weekend. Let's invite him to that. And we sort of default to the extrovert mode when he may be an introvert and he doesn't want to come to the barbecue and socialize. He doesn't want people coming over to his house. And it's also given me pause to think about, in the LDS faith, we have what's called home teaching. So every priesthood member is assigned 3 or 4 families, maybe in the typical scenario, and they're asked to go visit these families once a month. And I think, well, what if an introvert doesn't want me to come into their world? Why, visiting and intruding and asking these questions. And so how can I better serve those that maybe need some nurturing, and whether it's because they're non-believing or that they're just not jiving with the culture of the ward? Any thoughts on, reaching out to those that are less involved?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we can sort of say that people, are not going to come to Christ unless they have someone who shares the faith with. We can sort of acknowledge that, but inviting them into this big social group, social activity may not be the most comfortable for a lot of people. And so, the sort of more personal one-on-one interactions. But I know people. I had a friend of mine who became a Christian by participating in a church group that just painted people's houses. They went around to houses of the elderly who were, unable to sort of do a lot for themselves, and they just painted their houses, and they invited some non-believers from around the community to do that. And talking was really not a part of it, but that service component, that offering of yourself was really appealing to him, and he ended up becoming a Christian out of that. And so I like the sort of activity or the sort of action-oriented groups rather than always the talking groups. I think there's a certain amount of power for people who are quieter, but who can still kind of offer service and help to others in a silent way. I think that could be a great witness.
Yeah, I love that. Wow. And it makes my mind takes my mind to an individual who, this was an award I was in a few years ago, and this individual would have never stood up during fast and testimony meeting and shared of his testimony and been so public about it. But you could ask him he was very handy, right? And I remember asking him to come help me with my water heater at one point, and he was there and he spent half the day. And I thought, this is how this individual shares his testimony is through service and participating. And that testimony just as bold and strong as the individual who stands up and says the bold and strong words, right? And I love that service component. I love that.
Absolutely.
Well, I have maybe one more question for you, but I want to give you an opportunity to, if people want to check out the book, where should they go if they want to learn more about you? And I know you're fairly active on Twitter, and that's a good place to start. But if people want to connect with you and read the book, where should they go?
The best place to get the book is on Amazon.com. We released the second version, the new revised and expanded version of it in August of 2017. It's called Introverts in the Church, Finding Our Place in an Extroverted Culture. The new edition has a blue cover with a yellow birds on the front, and the new edition is quite a bit better than the second edition. I also have a book called The Listening Life, which is one to look at as well. I have a blog, adamsmchugh.com. I don't really use it much anymore. I am on Twitter at adamsmchugh as well. You can find my contact information on my blog as well. So those are the best ways. The InterVarsity Press, Ivy Press, also has the books that I've published as well.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, as we wrap up here, and I think one point that that needs to be emphasized is in the book, you're not, in no way are you trying to argue that introverts need to be coddled, right? Or treated special or anything, but because everybody needs a level of discomfort in our faith journey. But I think just being aware of these different, as on the scale of introverts and extroverts, where people fall, and that their faith experience may be different than yours, or how they interact with the divine may be different than that of an extrovert. And I love this quote that I'm not sure, I think it was near the end of the book. He said, the critical question to ask is not, do the leaders act like me? Rather, is do they affirm the variety of personalities, gifts, and experiences in the Christian life? Or do they try to conform people to a mold of faithfulness? And just as we wrap up, what are your thoughts on what's the final encouragement for leaders that have introverts in their congregations?
Yeah, it's simply that there are ways of expressing the Christian faith, living out the Christian faith in ways that do not conform to an extroverted mold, that are really more culturally based than they are spiritually or historically based. That gifting is not centered around temperament, and often the people that we sort of might disqualify culturally may have some of the most profound gifts, whether it's service or hospitality or teaching or anything along those lines. And so if we can become aware of our own sort of cultural biases and realize that is not necessarily intrinsic to our Christian faith, then we can start to have, I think, more united churches. We can start to encourage people to express their gifts in ways that are true and unique to who they are. And I just think it's a more powerful witness when you have both extroverts and introverts that are partnering together, to build up the church.
That concludes my interview with Adam McHugh, and this one I really enjoyed it. Just gave me a moment of pause as I went through his book and also had this interesting discussion with him that you've just heard. I hope many of you will just take a moment to stop. Again, you don't have to reformat everything you do, to change the ways that you lead per se, but it's all in the little things. Consider the individuals in your ward or stake, in your Relief Society, in your quorum, who maybe are more introverted than others, and what little things can you do to really stimulate their faith experience as they attend church or during home teaching or visiting teaching? What can we do to reach out to them? And the more we just understand this and think about it, I think we're going to be better leaders, especially to those introverts. Remember, solve the burden of meetings by visiting leadingsaints.org/14 and getting 14 days access to the Meetings with Saints virtual library.
It came as a result of the position of leadership which was imposed upon us by the God of heaven, who brought forth a restoration of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And when the declaration was made concerning the only true and living church upon the face of the earth, we were immediately put in a position of loneliness, the loneliness of leadership, from which we cannot shrink nor run away, and to which we must face up with boldness and courage and ability.